Hello, Shemai, welcome back to Wales in the Movies on the vlog Croeso nôl I Wales in the Movies and a vlog. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that is guaranteed to unify us all. We're going to talk about Brexit and we're going to talk about British nationalism. Yippee! So, I was sitting in the cinema about a year ago. I can't remember what I was about to watch, but I saw a trailer for this film, a biopic of Winston Churchill, starring one of my very favourite actors, Brian Cox. And while I was watching the trailer, I got a little bit annoyed and I started to get a little bit hot and bothered. And I couldn't work out why until I remembered a few minutes later that upcoming that summer was also going to be released Christopher Nolan's movie Dunkirk, which also towards the end featured Winston Churchill. And then I realised why I was getting so het up. And that is because the presence of these two films was highlighting something that makes me very, very nervous. And that is British nationalism. Now, when I say British nationalism, let me clarify that, please. I don't mean this kind of thing. What I mean by British nationalism is this.
Will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans.
This kind of stuff, and also this. The ordinary, mostly well-intentioned Brit who laps up the media and artistic narrative of the British state and its history. So, let's talk about Brexit, because if there's one thing that we haven't talked about enough over the last 18 months, it's Brexit. You may have voted to leave the European Union. You may well have voted to stay in the European Union. Either one is fine by me. Personally, I have no doubt that there is skullduggery and corruption within the EU. And I appreciate that a lot of people, maybe even a lot of people watching today, will have voted to leave the EU for well thought out reasons and for all the best intentions. Good for you. But I'm also in no doubt whatsoever that the vote to leave the EU by the UK and the referendum itself was not orchestrated and organised by a bunch of well-intentioned people in order to serve the people of the island, ordinary dudes like you and me and our families. Also, I am in no doubt whatsoever that the majority of the vote to leave the EU was based on the emotional whims of a ill-informed majority whose view of Britain, the UK, most of which is England, is a highly distorted and myopic one, which is formed by decades of a one-sided and myopic narrative of its history in media, in our schools, and as a result in our homes and in our families. Whatever issues you may have with the EU, I promise you the UK is worse, much worse. And here's the thing, the UK is far more beyond reform than the EU, being 700 years older. So, where does this habit of blaming nasty foreigners for all our ills come from? Well, there's a new Winston Churchill film out in the cinema this week in the UK and US cinemas. No, not the one from last year with Brian Cox. This one is called Darkest Hour and it stars another one of my formerly favourite actors, Gary Oldman. Personally, I don't think we're going anywhere near far enough and we're in danger of losing our British identity by only making two films about Winston Churchill. For me, I would do an entire imperial cinematic universe, and you could kick it off with a prequel about Winston Churchill's time as colonial secretary when he cut his teeth by starving loads of Indians to death and sending in troops against the Irish, the Scots and the Welsh. As you can see, the makeup that Gary Oldman is wearing for the film is pretty similar to that he wore for Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula in 1992, just with a little bit more latex blubber. And there are maybe some personality similarities, but I think that Dracula was perhaps less reliant on the blood of others for his international reputation. Now, looking at two Winston Churchill biopics within a few months, you may say in response that it's common for films with similar topics and themes to be released close to each other in Hollywood, and you'd definitely be right. But in the case of post-Brexit British nationalism on cinema, since the European referendum leave vote in 2016, not only have we had these two Winston Churchill biopics, we've also had Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, and most curiously, the Welsh movie Their Finest, which was, incidentally, funded and produced by the Welsh government, and it had a certain meta quality to it because the theme of the film was about British wartime propaganda movies. In the Welsh government's self-proclaimed year of legends, they couldn't finance or produce a film about, King Arthur, Owain Glyndŵr, Gwen Llian, Llywelyn the Last. They instead go for British nationalist propaganda, and I find that very interesting and consistent with their MO. Now, I personally predicted after seeing the first trailer for Churchill back last year with Brian Cox that we would see a rise in British nationalist cinema post-Brexit, and I'm depressed to confirm that this is definitely coming true. My questions to you are as follows. Why do we never, and I mean ever, see movies where Britain invaded other countries? And number two, why are the moments that are taught to us as pivotal in British history always the moments where Britain had defended itself against foreign invaders?
England is under threat of invasion. And though we be on the far side of the world, this ship is our home. This ship is England.
We hear the Spanish guns over the water. Soon now, we will meet them face to face.
That there is no one who will deny that England should fight on, even though the remainder of the continent of Europe is dominated by the Germans. I must therefore request that not one more fighter be sent across the Channel. If the home defense is drained away in desperate attempts to remedy the situation in France, defeat in France will involve the final, complete, and irremediable defeat of this country.
1066, Agincourt, the Spanish Armada, Trafalgar, Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, etc, etc, etc. Now, you may say to me, Nick, all countries push and teach a romanticised version of its own history. And my response would be, do they? Have you lived in those countries? Have you watched their television? Do you watch their national cinema? I'm sure that some countries do this, especially former imperial ones, but there's a difference with the United Kingdom, and there's a responsibility with particularly imperial or former imperial countries to push a more realistic narrative. And here's why. For 500 years before World War II, Britain dominated and controlled half the world down the barrel of a very big fucking gun. We drew lines on maps. We stole lands and resources. We caused destruction, famine. We wiped out entire communities and languages. We raped women, stole their children, and in many cases caused untold suffering, the ramifications for which are still being felt in many places across the world today. Despite diversity on our streets, despite diversity on our screens, I still take no pleasure in articulating to you my opinion that the British are fundamentally racist, and I'll tell you why. Not teaching the ugly history of empire and conquest in our schools and not commenting on it in our media has some very tangible effects in the 21st century. The unspoken assumption of a lot of British people, I would say most British people, is that Britain dominated the world for 500 years as the result of some kind of Darwinian superiority, or maybe even worse, inevitability. And you know what? I don't blame us. I don't blame the British people for thinking like this. Why would you not think like this when you've never been shown the real reasons why Britain had this power in the first place? The self-image of most British people, particularly my parents' generation, and especially my own, is of a proud and altruistic people who bravely defended and saved the entire world from the Germans. They have never been fed any other narrative. This is British nationalism. This is Brexit. This is not evil people. This is not calculated. This is the understandable result of a one-sided and myopic artistic and media narrative going back decades. I'm afraid you don't have to go looking at the likes of UKIP to get a taste of this uniquely British delusion. This is the emotional position of most of the British left wing, never mind the British right wing, who kicked all this nonsense off in the first place. I know from hundreds of conversations I've had throughout my life, from back in the 80s as a small boy to now in 2018 as a near 40-year-old geezer, that the Brits have an obsession with World War II that is bordering on a dark fetishism. It's really kind of weird. Scratch the surface of any British nationalist, and again, I don't mean the football hooligans, I mean my family and your family, and you will find the subject of World War II crops up in the conversation within a couple of minutes. Mention Scottish independence, mention Welsh independence, talk about the reunification of Ireland as being in the best interests of everybody, and you will hear the notion that we all fought the Nazis together brought up within about 30 seconds. It is, of course, very easy to deflect and to point the finger at Nazi Germany when you've never been shown that the first concentration camps on planet Earth were created by the British in South Africa. As I've said before, I've travelled around the world a couple of times. Yeah, check me out. But let me tell you a story. A conversation I had with a third generation mixed race Australian man in outback New South Wales in late 2000 totally changed the way I think about Wales, the UK and the world forever. I was sitting in his caravan drinking a bottle of Tooheys New after a hard day's chipping cotton, and during a conversation I realised that I had never ever considered why there were white people all over Australia. I'd never even thought about this before. I certainly wasn't taught about the British rape and destruction of Indigenous Australians in my school history of 5 years, but you know what I was taught for 3 fucking years? World War II. So yeah, the Germans. Let me say that, of course, I understand World War II is an important part of British and world history and definitely deserves a place in our narrative. But also let me say, on my travels, I've encountered hundreds of Germans, particularly young Germans, and let me tell you that the difference in national and personal humility and self-awareness between your average young Brit and your average young German is absolutely striking. Germany is a nation that has been motivated to teach and deconstruct all aspects of its history, including the most ugly ones. Allied victory in World Wars I and II has allowed Britain to totally obscure its own. This can't continue. World War II lasted approximately 5 years. Let me ask you, how many films have been made about this period? 200 or more? How many films have you seen about this time period? So let's flip it round. For example, the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade lasted 250 years. How many films have you seen about that? It's always Britain under attack, isn't it? Britain, the noble defenders of themselves and the free world. Cobblers. For example, the only British film to focus itself on the transatlantic slave trade was a film called Amazing Grace back in the noughties, which focused on the abolitionists. Unbelievable chutzpah. We rape, thieve and pillage for 250 years, then we decide to glorify the very moment when we stopped raping, thieving and pillaging. Criminal myopia. Let's look at another British film in Africa, Zulu, another film with a solid Welsh connection. This is about the British Army as colonists defending themselves from attack in Africa. That's right, British colonists nobly and bravely defending themselves from an onslaught of Africans in their own country. This is the cinematic equivalent of that burglar, those burglars who you read about that try and break into some family's house, and when they get caught and whacked over the knee with a baseball bat, sue the family for their injuries and their hospital bills. Look at the reaction to films such as Braveheart, a film which dared to paint the English as invaders and antagonists. Historically inaccurate, they cry. Typical Hollywood, they cry. Typical bloody Scottish, they cry. Always banging on about being Scots, aren't they? Before swanning off to go and watch the latest Bond movie and listen to the Queen's speech. This is Brit nationalism. Not the BNP, not the black shirts, not the skinheads and the football hooligans. It's your family. It's my family. Those who believe, whether they say so or not, that to be British is to avoid accountability, analysis and scrutiny, to have an inherent right to rule others, to be exceptional. So look at this picture of Nigel Farage here. Now, you may see an evil racist man, as well as a toad, of course, but you know, I don't. Okay, I see the toad, but I see a man who's genuinely nostalgic and emotional about a time when Britain ruled the world and then defended itself nobly from the nasty Germans. I see a man who believes the British to be exceptional. He doesn't think there's anything wrong with what he's doing. He doesn't think he's racist. So, back to post-Brexit cinema. You haven't seen the last of this, is my prediction. I'm going to predict a steady stream of movies based on World War II over the next 10 years. As it should transpire to anyone capable of original thought, Britain is not a country. Let that sink in, folks. Let me say it again. Britain is not a country. The United Kingdom is a nation state comprised of 3 to 4 nations, depending on your opinions on Cornwall, and about 10% of another one in Ireland. The foundations of this nation state are starting to crumble beneath us, and that's because we're now living in the age of information, where the roots of those foundations themselves are rooted in information which has been obscured. The core of one British identity is based on delusions of grandeur and fantasies of warfare. My request to you is to look out for this British nationalism. Be aware of this British nationalism and question it when you see it. When your uncle, your colleague, or your mother tells you how fantastic Winston Churchill was, tell them that Winston Churchill intentionally starved millions of people to death in India and then blamed it on them for breeding like rabbits. Tell them that Winston Churchill was openly bigoted against what he called inferior races. And when you get the inevitable response, which I promise you will be something along the lines of, "Oh, well, that was a different time, things were different back then," tell them that the UK put Winston Churchill as the face of their £5 note last year. Tell them that in a BBC poll in 2002, Sir Winston Churchill topped that poll as the greatest ever Briton, and he was presented as such by one of the most left-wing and gentle members of Parliament that we had, a lady called Mo Mowlam. This is British nationalism. It's in our time and it's happening now, and we can't allow decent people, particularly our kids' generation and further on, to have this bullshit delusional narrative pushed on them for decades more. For most of the rest of planet Earth, Britain has been a thief, a murderer and an antagonist. Deal with it. Whether you're pro or anti-EU, please question the media you're presented with, and don't let a delusional British nationalism form a cornerstone of your own self-image. You're disregarding the suffering of millions of people across the world, and you're doing them and yourselves a huge disservice. Humility and self-awareness await you. All you have to lose is your chains. Hwyl fawr.